This video is from Ron and Sue Garrett from Garbrook Bazadaises, who started breeding the Bazadaises cattle in 1994. They have now retired from their farm at Bazadaises, where they ran 50 head of breeders, to a small 3-hectare property at Boonah, which is about 60 kilometres from Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. Currently they have 3 Bazadaises cows, one of which is Georgina, who they bred 10 years ago and carries Gardon, Obus, Fuso bloodlines and has just calved to Caesar. The video of the 2 bulls is in very dry conditions. The smaller bull is 12 months old with Bengal Oscar bloodlines, and the older bull is 4 years old with Valon Hector bloodlines. Sue has given a snapshot of some of the cattle they have bred and shown over the last 25 years, promoting the Bazadaises in Australia at field days and major shows in Sydney, Brisbane and Rockhampton. Australia is a hard country to farm. It can be lush and green or dry and dusty, but the Bazadaises seem to handle the extremes of our weather very well and quickly return into good condition when the country has had rain and more to offer in feed. The full-blood Bazadaises makes a good cross in Australia with other breeds, producing a hybrid vigour, causing faster growth rates and quicker turn-off for the cattle being finished ready for market on either grass or grain, to achieve a top price in the sale yard being sought after by processors. Ron and Sue have visited Bazadaises and the UK 3 times to look at the Bazadaises, and has been a pleasure to meet the breeders and see the Bazadaises numbers growing and the young breeders taking up the cause to secure the future of the breed in their home of Bazadaises. We had the pleasure of Bernadette Darkos visiting us in Australia on 2 occasions to judge our Bazadaises at the Beef Australia in Rockhampton, the biggest cattle show in the Southern Hemisphere. Sadly, Bernadette is no longer with us, but we remember her fondly and would love for more visits from French breeders to Australia sometime in the future. This video is from Chris and Marianne Wiley, who are situated in Gympie, about 3 hours north of Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. They have been breeding Bazadaises cattle for approximately 20 years. They first started using Bazadaises semen over their Simmental cows as they wanted to increase the yield of their progeny. They were extremely impressed with the results and progressed to purchasing their first bull in 2002, who was called St. Peter. He was a 3-year-old bull that was from an imported embryo by Zoot out of Gertrude. In the following years, Chris and Marianne purchased numerous French embryos and semen from France and England to improve their genetics. Chris and Marianne are keen competitors at their local carcass competition and have won numerous classes over the years, including the prestigious Charlie Cotter All-Rounder at the Gympie Carcass Classic with their Bazadaises cross cattle. Shown in the video are full-blood 2nd and 3rd cross Bazadaises cows from medium, Izoot, Bengal and Babacool bloodlines. Most of the larger calves shown in the video are by the French bull Mighty. The yellow crossbred calf is a 2nd cross steer, which is a 3/4 Bazadaises, 1/4 Droughtmaster, weaned at 8 months old at a weight of 330 kilos. The bull shown standing with the cows is by Babacool, and Chris and Marianne are commercial breeders of full-blood Bazadaises and have supplied numerous Bazadaises bulls to breeders over the years and are keen to protect the full-blood French heritage and genetics of the Bazadaises in Australia.
Rose Bay Bazadaises stud is owned by Francis and Leslie Smith, who semi-retired from irrigated intensive farming on 1,200 hectares to an 80-hectare uncleared block on the Burrum River, which is located 300 kilometres north of Brisbane, Queensland. They cleared and developed the property with improved pasture. They were looking at breeds of cattle to run on the block and at that stage had no thought of going into stud. Francis and Leslie then saw the Bazadaises and fell in love with the attributes, that is length, muscling and oval bone, which all point to the tremendous meat yield. At that stage they could not buy unless they became a stud, as the numbers of Bazadaises in Australia were still low. They were able over the first 2 years to buy a mixture of older cows plus a line of heifers bred from Tynan, an embryo transfer bull by Izoot, the cows being various French AI progeny including Geordie, Marin, Pasha, Tom, and along with others. The first bull they purchased was bred from Norbert, as the female bulls they had seen by Norbert were quality cows, being good milkers, which is a very important trait for cows. Some of the best cows that they bought were by Marianne. One outstanding cow was sired by Relax and produced a stunning bull calf, which through the show ring proved his worth, and for a number of years he was one of their main stud bulls. They got very good females and bulls using Oscar semen. One bull was put into stud work and went on to produce some excellent females and bulls. After a couple of years, he was sold to another member who kept most of his females back because of the quality and temperament of his calves. They were also impressed with Caesar's progeny, a lot of which they kept for breeding purposes. The Caesar bull is still one of their main stud bulls, along with one of Imprévu and another bull that goes back to Oscar. A few years ago, they sold 105 stud cattle to a new member from North Queensland, there being 35 stud bulls and the remainder females and calves. They were being used to infuse better quality meat and yield in Brahman cattle, which are mostly used through North Queensland. Francis and Leslie are using Bazadaises over South Devon and Red Poll for commercial purposes and also attempting to breed poll cattle. They have always been very impressed with the tremendous gain in length, the dressing percentage, and excellent meat quality they put over other breeds, and the reports back from the local butchers and their customers reinforce their faith in the breed. Early into starting with Bazadaises, they were fortunate enough to butcher and eat one of the Bazadaises. They were so impressed with the meat, they have hardly eaten any other breed since. To this date, they are still very much in love with their quiet and friendly Bazadaises.